All right, great. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I know this is the end of the day and the last one right before a party, so good on you guys for sticking it out and going through this. So I'll be talking today about Anarchy and the march towards data localization and explain even what that means, because it probably is kind of a nebulous title for a lot of people who aren't in the weeds in a lot of this stuff. So quick on my background, I'm a quantitative social scientist at Endgame. And so in addition to running our technical blog, which I'll give the one shout out for that if you guys want to take a look at that, a lot of good research on there. In addition to running that, I do my own research on the geopolitics, really the intersection of geopolitics, cybersecurity, and technology. And so you'll see a lot of that combined together today. A lot of my research actually has stemmed more so on changes in adversarial behavior across state and non-state actors, and then the integration of the information operations that are coming along with that. And as I was doing a lot of that research, this notion of data localization kept popping up. And it's not something that I've seen a lot within the security conference circuit. It's talked a lot about in more of the legal realm. And though I'm a political scientist, so I'm not going to be boring you to death with a lot of the legalese and a lot of the stuff. I'm going to bring it up a level and really draw about how it relates to security, privacy, and a lot of the concerns that we have within this community. So I'll start off with a quote from Eric Schmidt. I think we're all familiar with him. This is a quote from 20 years ago. He talks about the internet is the first thing that humanity has built that humanity doesn't understand, the largest experiment in anarchy that we have ever had. And so, leaning on my political science background, anarchy actually is one of a key tenet within political science and international relations. So it's a lack of a central authority. And so, when he's talking about this, translating that over there, there's a lack of central authority within the internet, and that's how it was built upon that foundation, right? So a lack of any type of government control, a lack of broader international governmental organization controlling all data flows and things along those lines. But this was 20 years ago, and honestly, it's proceeded, very much in line with this for quite some time. But really, over the last decade or so, more and more countries are starting to try and contain this anarchy and try and contain some sort of authority over the data flows within their borders. And so there's really two different segments that we see going on in the U.S. and more of the democracies. We still see a big policy and technology divide. Policy does not innovate. Law doesn't innovate. Ethics changes don't tend to stay pace with technology. And I think we all know that fairly well. Technology is exponentially growing at a very, very rapid pace. Policy, especially in the U.S., has remained relatively stagnant. I think a lot, the main laws that get discussed in the security conferences is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is 30 years ago. So not seeing a ton of policy innovation yet on the U.S. side and across some of the democracies. Authoritarian regimes, though, however, have been innovating in this area and innovating in some really interesting ways to help promote their own objectives. And so that gap is decreasing quite a bit. And so what I'll be talking about a lot is some of the innovations that the authoritarian regimes are doing as far as digital policy, and contrast that with some of the democracies. But as I do that, let's first take a step back. I have to do the definition so we're all on the same page for what data localization is. And so from the more broad legal framework, it's really requiring the data to be collected, stored, processed, really everything you can do to it within the sovereign borders of a country. And so that's sort of the really narrow lens of what data localization is. But I look at it as one of many, many policies that governments are pursuing right now to control information, both from the governments to control and to protect privacy from the individuals. So it depends on which angle you're looking at. And within that realm, we have to look at data localization in a much broader context. And so just to step back a bit before we get more into the weeds, there are these two different notions. One is a cyber sovereignty model that's going on within the international arena for the shaping of the internet, especially within countries' borders. And so cyber sovereignty is one of those terms that, ostensibly it sounds great because it's, governments to be able to have some type of control of what goes in and out of their countries. And very similar to what we see in the physical world, sovereignty is a very big concept, and the respect of it is basically a core tenet of the Westphalian state system. But when you go into the digital realm, it's, on the one hand, a lot of the terminology that's used, it is to say to protect data and provide some security. But when it's within these autocratic regimes, it's really much more so for governments to access that data. And so it helps inform the surveillance state. It can help inform various kinds of censorship. And then it even goes into how they approach the various kinds of targets for cyber attacks. So whereas almost anything could become a target, as opposed to more of the multi-stakeholder model, which is trying to push forth more of a constrained realm of what is and is not within the cyber norms, what's acceptable behavior for being targeting. And so that's the cyber sovereignty model on one hand. And on the other hand, we've got the multi-stakeholder model. And that's where you see much more so in democracies. You see this is the model that's being pushed forth at a lot of the international governmental organizations like the UN, G20, even OPEC. And so it's not necessarily entirely democracies, but it has a lot of the tenets that are underlying democracies, pushing forth more so for freedom of information, protection of data, preventing countries from attacking perhaps critical infrastructure, making that off limits. And so there are really two different mindsets. And so at the end of the day, countries fall somewhere along this spectrum. It's not necessarily a black or white thing. And so what we're continuously seeing are countries starting to line up somewhere along the spectrum with the multi-stakeholder model on one hand, which is more of your utopian vision, and then you have the cyber sovereignty model on the other, which is much more so the government control of data. And so what I'd like to do is go into three different models that go into that. And so the Chinese model, which China's really been the one who's been pushing forth cyber sovereignty the most internationally and domestically, and has been doing so for a couple of decades at this point. The Russian model and how they approach it, and then the EU model, which is much more so indicative of the multi-stakeholder model. So let's start with China. So again, it's been several decades since China has first started notions of cyber sovereignty and talking, and the way they look at data was much more so looking at cybersecurity as a national security issue, and then from there transgressing that down, where information control, intelligence control, all those things go into the broader national security imperative for the government. And so you can trace back about 20 years and see some discussions along those lines. And even if you think about the Great Firewall, that was dubbed in the late 90s. And so for quite some time, China has been slowly implementing and enacting various policies along these lines. Some of the most prominent themes, the cybersecurity law of the PRC, and this is the one that was passed a couple years ago and just went into effect last year. And so on the one hand, it really just tightens up a lot of the laws that were already ongoing during that time, especially when it comes to having data being stored within the country and the ability to access that kind of data. But it also gets into the longer-term focus on the internet control, what the government can access, and then it hits into the various themes. It's the Great Firewall, controlling what goes in and out of the borders. So cross-border data flows definitely is one of those things. That includes what could potentially be state secrets. And so again, it's one of those things that becomes fairly it's vaguely worded, and you'll see this actually throughout a lot of this. One of the challenges with a lot of these policies are that they are intentionally vague to help enable governments to have a greater flexibility in what they want to have fall under those areas. And so, what might be a state secret, at the end of the day, I can imagine almost any of us could justify almost anything being a state secret. So, it keeps it vague in that area. One of the key components, though, really, and this is something to stress, is the government as the core protector and manager of the digital content and data. And this is really where you see sort of that cyber sovereignty notion where it is the government's job to control, provide that security, over and help manage and operate data. And this is going to be very, very different than how we see that in more of the GDPR from the EU. And it also fits into the notion of indigenous development and growth, ensuring that things that are made in China and that the Chinese government has access to what is actually physically located in China. And so made in China, it's a 2025. It's a big push going on right now for domestic innovation. And where you see a lot is you see strong connections between the state-owned enterprises and the government within China, which isn't necessarily what we see in other areas. And if you look at the Facebook hearings that went on in the U.S., and seeing the difference between the government and the private sector, it's much more blurred lines in China in that area. And so that also impacts data access and protections of data. And so you think of companies that are doing business in China, there are a lot more different concerns to think about. And so I'll talk about some of the individual and corporate impacts for as individuals in China and for the corporations as well. One key area is the increased censorship and surveillance that can come from all this additional data, additional control of the data going on. Something that has popped up is also Wired had a really great article on their social credit system. I think they wrote about a month or two ago, and I'd recommend reading if you have any interest in that. It's basically a system that the Chinese government is rolling out for a ranking of individuals and corporations within China. And so it's based on a whole series of things. If you can think about, in the U.S., we've got a credit rating system. It's that on extreme steroids. It includes social media content that you're posting. It includes whether you're in debt or not, whether you've had any time in jail, all those kind of things. And even within the scores of your own network itself, it all gets rolled into that. And they've started rolling this out a bit here and there. across the country, and it's a system that they're going to be continually evolving. And so again, all that data will be locally stored within China, and it will cover really almost every gamut of individual life within the country. For corporations, which is where probably a lot of us might wonder what's going on, it puts intellectual property at risk. And so, especially with this new law that came out, the one that rolled out in 2017, has a particular emphasis on critical infrastructure. And again, that remains somewhat vague how they're defining that. But it really was an emphasis to try to give the Chinese government the ability to access that personal data stored by critical infrastructure companies as they see fit. And this also includes websites that are hosted within China as well, and so it's impacting a lot of social media platforms too. So that is one model. And again, one thing to keep in mind actually with all of these as I talk through them, these are all evolving, right? So what I'm giving you now is somewhat a snapshot in time. So a lot of these laws are coming out over a period of time, and I imagine they'll continue to evolve, and this is something that I'll highlight towards the end. So the Chinese model, I think, probably is a bit more well-known. And then when we think about Russia, especially in the United States, we think about just information operations and trolls and those kind of things that the Internet Research Agency. But we don't really think as much, I don't think, about the data localization aspects of it, which all does go into the pursuit of information control from the government. So I'll do the same thing walking through Russia a little bit. So Russia also has a relatively recent law. And it goes, a bit further than the Chinese law as far as requiring all data on Russian systems to be stored within Russia. And so it's a little bit different from the Chinese model. One of the things that also is actually interesting in comparing and contrasting the two, Russia has been much more proactive in this area. And so if you think about a company like LinkedIn just a few years ago refused to adhere to some of these laws and was banned. And so there's much quicker repercussions that we're seeing as far as Russian proactivity in countering some of these countering companies that are failing to comply to the laws. It also includes prohibiting VPN access and anonymization, and so wanting to ensure that they know who people are on the internet, being able to track them down better. And then the interesting one, I think especially for this audience, is requiring source code for security products. And there are security products already that have handed over source code to the Russian government in an attempt for access to that market. And that's something that, especially in the China case as well, there are all these repercussions that companies could potentially face when doing business in these countries, and it's not just China and Russia. I'll show some other ones as well. But it's a calculation that corporations are going to have to make as far as the risk of loss of IP, perhaps, in return for immediate access to enormous markets, right? And so that's where you get some of the business challenges come into play. So it's not quite as simple as just whether or not countries want to hand over their IP. So similar to what's going on in China, Russia is attempting to copy some aspects of the Great Firewall. It's not there yet, but it definitely likes that idea and is trying to build towards that. Within the information security doctrine as well, there's a lot of emphasis on controlling data within the borders. And so, again, this is something that, again, we think about more of the disinformation and the fake news and that kind of thing. But Russia also is really leading the way in many areas for trying to control data within their own borders as well. And so for individuals, again, it's more censorship and surveillance. But then there also is the disinformation internal societal divisions. Russia also often uses within Russia itself and then some of its nearby neighbors, uses it as a test bed for other tactics to be used against other states down the road. So it also has a lot of testing that can go on as far as some of these tactics. For corporations, obviously there are costs of moving servers within the Russian borders, some data migration costs that come along with that. And I think an interesting one that just came, what I saw within some of the Russian experts were translating a series of Russian news reports over the last week. And Russian state news media said all countries will build virtual borders. It's inevitable and it's very good for all of us. So there already is starting to be this information disinformation campaign showing how great it is for there to be borders within the internet and for Russia to control all data within. So there also is a little bit of marketing going on as far as how great this is for the Russian population. And finally, get to the European Union. And so those, again, are one end of the spectrum, falling under more of the cyber sovereignty model. Now we're moving over to the multi-stakeholder model. And the European Union really is the one, the farthest advanced political entity in this area. I think a lot of us probably have been getting inundated with GDPR compliance emails, and you see lots of that popping up on blogs across the security community. And it's interesting, and still, I think by the latest studies, it shows that most companies still are not even close to being ready for compliance. And so, what the heck's all that compliance even mean, and what are they trying to do? So the General Data Protection Regulations coming into effect in I think about 4 weeks, around May 25th, and so it's an expansion of some ongoing regulations that they already have, really focused on individual privacy. And this is where, if you want to look at any of the two tenets, think about comparing and contrasting for data localization. On the cyber sovereignty model, it's government control of the data. On a multi-stakeholder model, it's individuals having regaining better control of their data. And again, not saying that all these are going to be that the objectives are actually going to be achieved through some of these policies. I honestly think it's going to take some time to fine-tune all these policies to achieve the objectives that they want. But at least the GDPR is a step in the direction for putting more power back onto the citizens for having control of their data. And it also puts more emphasis on corporations to be held more accountable for maintaining the security of their data. So again, that's something that very much is relevant for this community, as far as corporations are going to have to prove that they've taken certain steps to help try and secure their data of the of their users. There's additional aspects of express consent, and I think we've seen a lot of this going on, again, stemming from the Facebook discussions that have been going on. This gets into some of the user experience aspect. There have been actually a fair amount of user experience blogs and so forth talking about how to gain express consent. Is it opting in versus opting out? And there are all these different kind of studies. And so hopefully a lot of those, that research and so forth may hopefully find its way into it to make it more of a seamless aspect. Algorithmic transparency is another one. And I think this again is one that's really, really interesting. We had Phil's here. He talked earlier about some of the machine learning and so forth that's going on, in our industry. And so what the GDPR wants is to be able to identify what some of the driving factors are behind some of those machine learning algorithms. And so that's not actually as easy as it sounds. Very often, it's very hard to identify what the main core factor is underlying a lot of it. But they're pushing towards that. And so I think there will be a lot more research going on in this area. And I think it's a really interesting area to think about, especially as you start thinking about some of the algorithmic biases that have been popping up in the research in that area. So I think that's going to be one of those areas that does come into security as well. And then for the data protection, it's a bit more of an expansive notion on what personal data is. It's the personally identifiable information, but also adding in some more of the hard selectors and content as well. And so you remember we've had plenty of conversations, I think, at these conferences about metadata and whether it matters or not. They're including a lot of that other information in there as far as what can be protected. And so how does this impact individuals? Interesting one is the right to be forgotten. And so that's, if you access to whatever, platform it is and have your information erased. You also have the right to access it. And so a lot of these are already happening, but it's becoming much more mandated. And it is, again, that focus on the individual privacy is really, really important. Another one is a breach notification. And this is something that, in the US we have a breach notification, and they had it in the EU as well. But it's such a minimal amount of money compared to what the corporations make, it really doesn't matter. And so you have to think about incentivization. And so for with the GDPR, when it rolls out, it's going to be 4% of the global annual funds that are coming in from the corporations. And so it's something before think about it was something that Google made in a second. And so it doesn't really matter. When you start thinking about the 4%. That's a decent amount of money, and so hopefully it's enough to stimulate corporations to do much more so and be much more proactive in the breach notification. The other thing that I think we forget about in the U.S. is it's any corporation that has data on EU citizens. So it doesn't actually matter if the corporation itself is located in the EU. This is again where it somewhat varies from some of these other data localization laws. It's just any corporation that has EU citizens' data. And again, defines for non-compliance, and there's third-party compliance required as well. So what about us? Usually the U.S. Has historically led the way in shaping a lot of the norms across international orders, especially since 1945. But for the most part, it's been a bit of a meandering story for the United States. They've got the CFAA, again, from the mid-'80s. And since then, we've really taken much more so of a sector-specific approach. And so if you can think about HIPAA, focusing more on healthcare, protecting healthcare data. Finance has their own areas. We're protecting financial data. But there isn't anything uniform, so it's very much a patchwork approach. And then in addition to patchwork by sectors, it's patchwork by states. And so these are just a couple of, New York, Tennessee, Ohio, California, all have either proposed or come close to implementing various policies that protect either data, like personal data going outside their borders, protecting, requiring access to or protection against personal data within their borders. So it takes a bunch of the different data localization aspects, but takes them to the state level. And so those will be really interesting. Again, there's a current one in California. It's a Consumer Privacy Act that is making a fair amount of news. But Facebook, Google, Twitter, a lot of the big tech platforms have lobbied against it. So again, this is an area where we're crossing over a lot in the security realm, and then what we're seeing going on right now, and changing honestly daily, it seems. Another one that's on the governor's desk right now is one in Georgia, which I think is very relevant for this community. Isn't necessarily data localization law, but impacts data security and privacy quite a bit. Because on the one hand, it seems to, on reading it, enable hacking back. And then also at the same time, it seems to limit legitimate uses for testing defenses. And so it kind of has a double whammy on what could be the outcome of that, and that's on the governor's desk right now, and so we'll have to see what happens with that. There's a Data Security Breach Notification Act. So again, stemming from the EU a little bit on those kind of notions, but it includes jail time if corporations are deemed to not have actually done due diligence in trying to protect the data. And then there's been other aspects of data localization that have been tried to be put into NAFTA and the TPP during some of those negotiations. Department of Defense looking at cloud computing and requiring those providers to be storing the data locally. And then one, just throwing this in there, showing just how much it impacts companies within the U.S. Or how even though they're companies are based in the U.S. and also working abroad, Apple's now storing data on Chinese citizens in China, and so we need to look at what kind of policies the U.S. is going to be doing to help and respond to that and help ensure security and privacy. And so, going through all this, does it seem that perhaps boundaries do exist on the internet? On the one hand, there's a lot of protectionist data policies that we see going out there, and this is a big impact. We see very often, as globalization ebbs and flows, there always is a pushback, and so this is a natural aspect in the rhythm of how international politics works. And so look at these, and you can look at some of the ones that are darker over there as far as which countries block different kinds of data sets or different kinds of data flows. And you overlap that with, this is the Freedom House freedom of the net, and which ones tend to be more censored. And so you see this overlap, which highlights just how closely the broader strategies for information control, how data localization fits into that within the for government strategies really across the globe. And if talking about those three countries wasn't enough, those activities really are diffusing down to other countries. And so this is what happens. If something seems to work at some of the major powers, other smaller countries are going to start adopting similar policies as it fits the needs of the government. And so again, keep in mind the government's one of their main objectives is to stay in power. And if controlling data or protecting their citizens' privacy are good means to help them stay in power, help maintain their regime type, they're going to do so. And so Kazakhstan's a good one, are requiring data to be stored in the country. Vietnam, at least one server in country, and it ensures that the government is accessible to it. And from there it goes, Canada has the right to be forgotten, similar to GDPR. South Korea is blocking mapping data. They don't want to allow mapping data to leave the country, and they're arguing for national security reasons. And it kind of goes on and so forth across various countries. And this is just a partial list of it, by the way. A lot of countries across the globe are advocating for various aspects of data localization laws. So that's a lot, and that's where things currently are. It's where our snapshot is right now. But the key thing is to not assume that this will be the current trajectory forever. There is a lot of ebbs and flows that go on in international relations, and as international systems evolve, democracy has had numerous waves, 3, potentially 4 waves of democracies expanding and retracting a bit. And so some of the themes that are actually going on right now, and again, going back to the pace of technology change, that is also, you're really instigating finally a tipping point where policies are starting to change as well. And I think we're going to see a lot more expedited policies coming in, I think, really over the next decade, and probably sooner than that. So on the one hand, the U.S., the U.S., which is known for not wanting regulation really of much at all, there's been a major push across parties for regulating big tech. And so this is something that, a year ago we would not have seen that. And for this to have happened over a 3-month time frame, it's a pretty significant movement going on. And that's just, the picture on the right is just, the fixed Facebook, and which isn't a data localization issue, but it's a data privacy issue, and that's where I actually think a lot of the data localization laws and data privacy and security laws that come in, they'll impact security as well, maybe stemming from some of these social media challenges that the U.S. is dealing with right now. But it's not just in the U.S., and there have been two actually really interesting events going on over the last 2 to 3 weeks. If anyone's been following the Russia and the ban on Telegram, so Telegram is a messaging app and was not adhering to Russia's data localization laws. And so Russia attempted to ban Telegram, and with that, people immediately found proxies to try and circumvent the ban. And from there, Russia then tried to block various IPs, ended up blocking millions of IPs, and ended up blocking access to taxi services, grocery services, various social media sites. I mean, it runs a whole gamut. And one place that I saw was, it was 18 million different IP addresses ended up getting blocked by that, somewhat accidentally. And there's been a really big pushback, within Russia from that. It's been called an internet civil war. It's led to, the Ministry of Education, the Science Division, basically pointed out that this has blocked and hindered major research going on within major scientific research within Russia. And then the latest articles over the last few days say the cost of this will be in the billions. And so that's really it's amazing watching that happen right now. And so again, it's something to keep an eye on and see how this evolves. Similar, just looking at protests in technology as well. Over the last few weeks, there was a notice that was written, basically describing an assault back in about 20 years ago at Peking University. The censors in China tried to take that down, trying to control the information, but someone put it on the Ethereum blockchain, and so now it is there. And so again, it's interesting ways, and by many of the Chinese watchers, they're saying that some of these protests that are going on now at these universities they've not seen anything even remotely close to this size since '89. And so it's really, really interesting how this is going on. Again, just something to keep an eye on. Not sure which direction things will go, but it's really a interesting turn of affairs, and that's why no matter how we think things are going, if it's going to stay in one direction, other things can always happen. When you look at this is a socio-technical system, there's going to be a lot of different variation and movement. And so at the end of the day, internet anarchy is what states make of it, and that's what we're seeing right now. Anarchy is what states make of it. It's a very famous book in political science about the social construction of the international system. I think the same thing is going on right now with a lot of these various data laws. And so we are seeing much more of a Splinternet progressing right now. Doesn't mean that's the way it's going to go, but it is much more so that it's more of a disjointed global system right now than what we've seen or anticipated in the past. And so it is, I think we're at the inflection point. I think it's going to be some combination of these two, so it's, again, something to keep an eye on. And then why all this matters, especially for those of us in the room, I do think this has a major impact on democracy, both for perhaps helping move transitions into democracy and transitions away from democracy. It can go both ways. Obviously, very important impacts on privacy, national security, innovation, and I think this is one that doesn't get talked about as much, but for a lot of these countries that are really blocking off access to the data, it is going to have an innovation impact on it, which means they may have to try and get some of their innovation elsewhere. So that's just something to keep in mind. Obviously impacts civil liberties, and then the global economy, especially when you start thinking about the global data flows and whether how much of those data flows will be blocked. So really, it crosses, I think the majority of things that we care about within this industry. So that is it. Thank you everyone for sticking around for this last talk of the day.